Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Peter Schuck, and we'll be doing part two of our interview. And in this interview, we're going to continue to talk about systemic racism. In part one, we discussed a litany of issues, and we ended that discussion by talking about charter schools and individual responsibility. Now we're going to talk about the Black family. All right, Professor. In your article, you note that Black families are not as stable as other families. And what is also interesting is that you also argue that Black men, even when they're educated, they're still less likely to marry. So highly educated women usually don't reproduce themselves, but highly educated men often get married and have children. But for Black men, it's different. And when Black men divorce, it's unlikely that they usually remarry. Yeah, I
Yes,
find these points
here
interesting.
here I'm relying very heavily on the work of sociologist Orlando Patterson, himself an immigrant from Jamaica, who I believe has appeared on a podcast that you've conducted. But he has done extensive work on the relationships between minority men and women and the effects of those relationships on their behavior.
Yes, and you said it. In fact, these men are less likely than poor Blacks to have ever married at all. And you're talking about upper class Black men. This is quite unusual.
Yes, yes, I was struck by it. I can't really account for it. As I say, I'm relying on Professor Patterson's data for this observation.
But men are crucial. They say Brookings, according to the Brookings Institution, Black poverty is about Black men. Black men are more likely to have a criminal rate, and this adversely affects their ability to get jobs. But we live in an age where men, not just Black men, but men naturally are being undermined. But children, especially boys, need their fathers. Fatherlessness is correlated with delinquency, and family instability is a greater predictor of poverty than living in actual poverty. So are the problems plaguing the Black family really a consequence? Sorry, are the problems plaguing the Black community really a consequence of the state of the Black family?
I think that's certainly a very important factor, maybe the most important factor. Um, and what the causes for those patterns of behavior within the Black family are is, of course, a very much disputed question. And the consequences are very great indeed.
Many economists have actually linked the decline in the Black family to welfare. Are you sympathetic to this view?
I don't know. The data are pretty striking, and Charles Murray, in his first important book, certainly emphasized that relationship. I don't know. I'm not um, as it, I'm not a master of that area of data, so I can't say that. There's certainly correlations, but whether the correlations are causal or not is a question I can't answer to my own satisfaction.
I have reviewed the data myself. I'm not an expert, but I'm still looking for other factors that could be leading to the decline in the family. The welfare argument, it's a bit sociological. It's more sociological than empirical, because what they're saying is that welfare makes it more efficient for women to be single. That's really the main argument.
Yes, that they don't need the men as much.
Yeah, so at presently I'm looking for something that seems to be more compelling. But what should also be stated is that usually some critics are what one writer calls family breakdown denialists. They tend to argue that Black men have not abandoned their children. the issue is that some black men are not living with their former wife or ex-girlfriend. But what such people fail to understand is that when parents don't live together, and we do have data on the topic, they can use the children as tools to spite each other. So a woman has money, she's expecting money from her ex-husband, and the ex-husband, for whatever reason, is unable to provide it within a certain time period. And despite her ex-husband, the children starve. And I can give you actual examples. I was speaking to a teacher in Jamaica who gave such an example. The woman had money, but she had to spite her ex-spouse.
Well, I'm sure there are many such examples, and I don't want to comment on the representativeness of these examples, except to observe that we know from extensive experience and observation and human experience that people who are in dire conditions tend to use whatever means are available to them to try to protect themselves and protect those whom they love, and ward off adversity and enemies. And children were recruited in those sorts of warfare situations. So it's not surprising. It's really not surprising at all that there are these findings that the children and the money that's available through the welfare system, scant as that money is, becomes a source of tremendous conflict in the family.
And there's another striking statistic in your article. White families, indeed, the fact that many of these same trends are also corroding impoverished white families while leaving Black immigrants whose marriage rates are over 70% higher than those of native-born Blacks relatively untouched, indicates that racism, systemic or otherwise, is not the primary driving force behind the patterns described. I was not familiar with this statistic before, the marriage rates of Black immigrants.
Yeah. Well, these differences are really quite striking, and you can imagine how what the effects of that would be on children and on the kinds of environments in which children grow up. The children's perceptions of the way in which men and women relate to one another and their sense of security and so forth.
And now we're going to talk about the interesting studies of two distinguished Black scholars, Harvard's William Julius Wilson and Orlando Patterson, starting with William Julius Wilson, isolation. What's the link between Black poverty and the isolation?
Well, the first there's the observation, which is a very interesting one, in which it's been shown that the types of, and then there's a Mark Granovetter, who I don't think you mentioned just now.
No, I didn't.
About weak ties and strong ties, and how his very interesting theory, and it seems to be supported by a lot of data that he puts together on the advantages of weak ties. The idea being the more people you know, the more opportunity you have, the broader your reach is, the more contacts you're likely to have for jobs and meeting people and forming friendships and generally connecting with the outside society. Whereas if your ties are strong, that tends to be correlated with a relatively limited geographical or sociological range of friendships. And so you really just, you hang around with and basically know your cousins and your and your uncles and your in-laws and so forth. And you don't know many other people, and that limits your opportunities to make progress in a variety of social venues. So that's that Granovetter theory is a very interesting one, and it makes a lot of sense. And apparently, other evidence, including Orlando Patterson's observations, suggests that the level of contacts, the number and scope of contacts that Black men have tends to be very limited. It's limited mainly to their relatives and very close friends, and so they find it harder to break out of that limited environment to make broader contacts that can help them exploit various opportunities.
Let me read what he said about his research. According to his research, Blacks' networks are smaller, denser, and include remarkably few kinsmen compared to those of other races. Indeed, almost half of Black individuals surveyed had no kinsmen in their networks at all, in a finding he characterized as truly startling. Patterson observed no relationship whatsoever between network density and education levels among this population. Now, Professor Orlando Patterson and Glenn Lowry and his co-authors both tested this theory some years ago. Network effects are really important. One academic, her name is Maya Beasley. In her book, she argues that Black students in college literally opt to keep a smaller network, and as a result, their opportunities for employment and economic success are not as significant as other groups. If you truly want to succeed, you must create value and network with people outside of your immediate social circle. So it appears that clannishness is a problem. Why are some people more clannish? It's debatable, many reasons, but I'm really interested in the relationship between networks and the success of Black Americans, especially upper class Black Americans who we would expect, because of their social class, would have a wider network, including more non-Blacks, but this is not really the case.
Well, I have done some research on my own a long time ago in connection with a book I wrote called Diversity in America, in which I canvassed the evidence on how much diversity value is produced by affirmative action. Diversity value being the kinds of increased exposures and more sophisticated sources of evidence resulting from people with differing backgrounds. And in the course of that, one of the people whom I interviewed on this, a person who has himself done a lot of research on the conditions on campuses, said that there is no more segregated society or sub-society in America than college campuses in terms of the clannishness of whites and Blacks, and that Black students on college campuses tend to stick with other Black students, and so that the diversity value that they might otherwise bring to the campus to affirmative action or just the different experiences that they might have by reason of being Black in a majority white society are really not really gained, not exploited, because they tend to stick to themselves, stick to their own group. Now, this is true of most groups, that they tend to be clannish, but this was a sort of a striking observation, because diversity has always been trumpeted as the great value of affirmative action, and not the only value of affirmative action, because the many supporters of affirmative action value it for reasons of increased social mobility. So diversity is kind of another justification for affirmative action according to its proponents. And yet we have these observations that college campuses are so broken down into little enclaves of people who stick to their own groups.
People naturally select for race. So in school and in college, people are more likely to speak to those who represent their race. And we have data on the perception of race and ethnocentrism, but I'm wondering that maybe the reason for clannishness among blacks is that some of these people, even when they're in the upper class, they still perceive white people to be racist, whether accurately or inaccurately. When
Well,
I
I think
went some years ago, I went to an event in America, and I was the only black person present. And the white people were charitable. I didn't have a problem with the white people, but when I returned home to Jamaica, people said, "You're the only you were the only black person. Didn't you feel uncomfortable?" No, I did not.
yeah. Well, clannishness is not confined, obviously, to black students on the majority white campuses. All groups that feel their group consciousness, their group existence very keenly for one because of discrimination or for other reasons, such as religion or whatever. That's not certainly not confined to black students. But all this talk about systemic racism uh, uh, and the insistence that whites are hostile to blacks, I think tends to reinforce this clannishness and this fear of venturing out beyond one's group, and it's a great misfortune, it's a great disadvantage, I think, particularly for blacks who need to increase the breadth of their contacts.
Exactly. So people talk about venture capital and technology, and venture capital being overwhelmingly white, even though one study said that venture capital is actually prefer Asian American women. But the point is this: if venture capital or any other profession is disproportionately represented by one group of people, and you want to make some headway in that group, you're going to need to venture outside of your immediate circle of friends. That's just common sense.
Yes, it's a matter of statistics, simple
And
statistics.
Pew, I have seen 3 reports by Pew saying that white Americans don't think that their racial identity is central to their being as a person. Minority groups have a higher level of racial consciousness than white Americans, including blacks. So this could be one reason for the higher level of clannishness among blacks. They're more racially conscious.
Absolutely. As a number of commentators have indicated, when if a black person ventures out into the public, he is at a greater risk of being singled out because of certain stereotypes that have been formed. That doesn't mean that the society is pervasively racist. It just means it's an example of what I call in my article racialism as distinguished from racism. Racialism is a heightened awareness of the race of others, not necessarily a hostile one or an invidious one, but just a consciousness of it. And the amount of racialism in our society, that is this heightened awareness of race, is I think very, very great. And so it's not at all surprising that when a black person ventures out into the larger world, he or she is going to feel that keenly.
And our last point on the topic of systemic racism is education. A third factor contributing to continuing Black-white disparities in America is schooling. Years of education and skills training are strongly correlated with wealth and income, and in recent decades, Blacks have made significant gains in their rates of high school graduation, which hovered around 25% in 1965 and are now at 88%, and the college enrollment 38% in 2018 compared with roughly 15% in 1968. This progress is laudable, but high school graduation statistics can see large proficiency shortfalls in English and mathematics.
Yes, when I wrote that, I had in mind the disparity between graduation rates and proficiency in the subjects that one is supposedly learning in order to graduate from schools. And these reduced proficiency rates suggest either that people are that schools are graduating people who are not yet fully competent in the areas in which they have studied, or that the standards of the schools are just too low, and people can meet those standards and still not be competent or proficient.
Yes, California, this is old, well, not that old, maybe over 2 years, but some time ago there was a headline: 75% of Black boys in a particular part of the country were not doing well academically. So we have clear data on the performance of students to reveal groups that are performing well and groups that are not performing well. And one reason why some groups fail to perform is that standards are lower. So Walter Williams, before he passed, in an article said that a teacher refused to punish a male student who was being disruptive on the account that he was expressing his culture.
Well, that's terrible.
Yeah, so you're basically telling Black boys that their culture is endearing them to become a gangster. Not true. That is racist.
I don't know if it's racist or it's just foolish.
Yes, stupid.
Yeah.
What are the expectations for Black boys, that they should become sports stars and entertainers? I've never been fond of that argument. Yes, obviously there are cultural differences, but why should you think that because somebody's Black, he should not conduct himself properly? You're not helping the Black student, and Walter Williams was quite upset, expectedly.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of schools that are struggling against that stupid presumption, and that trying to change that culture. And I think they're more likely to be schools are more likely to do that if they have to compete with charter schools and schools where parents have choice. Which is one of the reasons why I think it's most unfortunate that the Democrats. I voted for Biden very enthusiastically compared with Trump, who's atrocious. But one of my great disappointments in Biden has been his submission to the teachers' unions in making it more difficult for school choice to be expanded.
You know, Donald Trump is a flawed character, but I do remember during his tenure, there were programs to increase the enrollment of Blacks in community college to make them ready for the world of work, etc., according to his defenders. And you are indeed correct on Biden. This is not going to become a political discussion, but I like leaders who are decisive, and sometimes when a leader is uncouth, is not afraid to challenge the established orthodoxy. So I guess that this is a plus to having a leader.
Well, I don't want to get into Donald Trump, whom I think is an extraordinarily flawed character and has done great damage to the American democracy. But I could certainly agree that blunt speaking and a willingness to confront assumptions that are incorrect or that have become part of the conventional wisdom and haven't been questioned, that's a good thing.
Yes. So Professor Schuck, luckily for us, your article is quite long, but we have discussed all the issues. So your fourth and fifth factors, issues relating to crime, they were already discussed in interview 1. So thanks for your time. It was a great interview.
I appreciate your time.
All right. Bye, sir. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.